Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Tom Sharoof, and I am once again joined by two guests, Marc Fasteau and Ian Fletcher. Marc is a vice chair for the bipartisan Coalition for a Prosperous America. Ian is on the advisory board of the Coalition for a Prosperous America, and their book jointly is Industrial Policy for the United States: Winning the Competition for Good Jobs and High-Value Industry. Our conversation took us into American economic history, the theory of free markets versus the theory of mercantilism, currency exchange, innovation in manufacturing, and much more. I hope you enjoy the episode.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Marc, Ian, thank you very much for joining me today.
Good to be with you.
Thanks for having us.
And your new book is Industrial Policy for the United States: Winning the Competition for Good Jobs and High-Value Industries. And some might say that the 2024 election was a referendum in some respects on trade, industrial policy, and the economy, ranked as a very high issue. And I've been hearing a lot about that we're in the sort of neo-mercantilist moment in at least the United States, if not the broader West, but certainly in the United States. So my question as an opener is, what is mercantilism? How does it conform or diverge, if at all, from the project that you have laid out in Industrial Policy for the United States?
Go ahead.
Well, mercantilism is basically the idea that nations exist in a genuine state of economic rivalry in the world, which a lot of free market economists will tell you it's an illusion, it's a construct of politics. Mercantilists, which includes us, say no, that there are some industries that are better than others to have in your country. They pay higher profits, they give you higher wages, they're more fruitful for driving the development of the rest of your economy. And other countries, some of them at least, know this, and they want to be the home of these industries as well. Which is why you see things like the first case that really came to Americans' attention was probably automobiles with the Japanese in the 1970s and the 1980s, where you have this incredibly important high-profit, high-wage industry with huge effects pulling through supply chains all through the economy, extraordinarily high percentage of the workforce connected in one way or another to automobile production. And Japan realized that being an export power in this industry would help them to pull up their entire economy from quasi-third world status up to being one of the richest countries in the world, which is what happened. Now, this happened at the expense of the American automobile industry, the British automobile industry, and a few others. Because if you're making Toyotas and exporting to them to the United States, you're not making Chevrolets here. You're not paying wages here. You're not paying profits to the stockholders of GM here.
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show.
And the reason, in terms of the background economic theory, that this is a case is because of the phenomenon, above all, of increasing returns, which means that when you get entrenched in an industry, you have pricing power, and you have what some people in business school called a moat. That is the ability to keep competitors out. As a result, the free market isn't naturally going to erode your position and restore an equilibrium. So you have a fight between nations to possess these industries. Now, I do not mean to imply that that's all that goes on in a capitalist economy. In fact, most of the U.S. economy is non-traded. Okay, everything: housing, education, local government, supermarkets. About 2/3 of our economy is local service jobs anyway. But The thing is that the industries that are internationally traded are some of the best industries, what we call in the book the most advantageous industries that are out there. Things like automobiles, a lot of technology, very expensive product, you can support high wages, aircraft, electronics, steel, genetic engineering, and a lot of mid-range stuff that's not that glamorous, like home appliances. That these are the industries you don't want to lose because you had a foolhardy trade policy where you opened your market to the rest of the world in 2024, above all China, but a lot of other countries as well. And they, by hook or by crook, didn't do the same for you. So these industries grow over there and they shrink here. And that's a real problem. And we are about pushing back against that with a whole lot of policies. Tariffs are the most obvious thing, but there's a long list.
What the implication of this is that, to put it very simply, trade is not always a win-win. In fact, for the most important tradable industries, it definitely is not a win-win. A very nice study by an economist who at one point was head of the American Economic Association showed that the cheaper goods that you get if you allow another country to become more efficient in one of these, what we call advantageous industries, they're not all high tech. That's why we don't use that term. If you lose one of those industries, and you lose it presumably because they can make it and sell it cheaper, whether it's because it's been subsidized or they're just more efficient, the gains for consumers by being able to buy the stuff cheaper is far outweighed by the losses of jobs, manufacturing, capital, and most important, the ability to be in the game for the next big thing that comes out of those industries. Because anything that's near the frontier of technology is very path dependent. You can't go from a vacuum to a 2 nanometer chip just because you decide to do it. You have to be pretty much in every step along the way. So if you get pulled out for a couple of years, you're really in trouble. Getting some of these industries back, like the high-end chip manufacturing in the U.S. is a perfect example. We're struggling with that right now.
Yeah, and Mark, could you say more about what path dependency is as a kind of, it's more than theoretical because it plays out, but when we're talking about that as a concept, what do you mean?
Yes, well, what you can't, you've heard the phrase climbing the ladder of technology. Well, what that means is you can't get to the top of the ladder when you're just on the bottom rung. You have to do the intermediate steps. No technology is totally brand new. It doesn't fall out of the sky. They always build on what's before. Sometimes there are big leaps, but you have to be at the step before to get to the next one. So what that says is that contrary to free market theory, where anybody can come in and just you put money in and you can compete, you have to have the technology, meaning the intellectual property, the know-how, the base of suppliers, the supply chain base. To be really crude, if you can't make steel and you can't import it, there's almost nothing in the high end that you can make. That's an extreme example. Of course, that's traded, but that's what it is.
Okay, and something you said just a minute ago too, Mark, was that in the most tradable goods, free trade is not always a win-win, or is often not a win-win. And I guess from the free trade side, the rejoinder to that I'm familiar with is that under the theory of comparative advantage, because each country is getting more efficient at what is naturally best at, or whatever its current capacity is most suited to, that free trade is always a win-win in that respect, because you're allowing each country to become most efficient and increase overall welfare in its respective industries. So what's your critique of that response or that position?
Well, there are a whole number of different assumptions that go that all have to apply for that to be true. And the most fundamental one, I think we have 7 in our book, and I won't remember them all, but Ian will remember those that I don't. Most fundamental one is that those relative efficiencies cannot be changed. So, for example, if you're making your country's making computer chips and mine is making potato chips, but there's no way that I can go from potato chips to computer chips, then I might as well, or like no way I can compete, meaning I can't make a computer chip that competes with what you're making in terms of efficiency and price and so on, then I might as well make potato chips and buy the computer chips. But as we know, every country that has done catch-up development, starting with Japan and cars. Their first cars were really pretty crummy, but they kept at it. They worked at it. They subsidized the hell out of it. They changed their comparative advantage. So the free traders just assume they're fixed. That's very fundamental. They also assume that if you lose an industry, that you still have full employment. It will never affect the amount of employment that you have. They also assume that the costs of moving to a new industry, the lost labor, lost wages, sunk capital, which is no longer has any value, that happens instantaneously, and basically the costs are disregarded. So I think I've missed. There are a couple more. Ian, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I want to begin by saying that the theory of comparative advantage, invented by David Ricardo in the early 19th century, was created in a very different world than the world we live in. And he's talking about a world in which most trade is in agricultural products, where you either have certain plants growing in your country or certain mineral deposits, or you don't. And the interesting thing, which I document in my first book, Free Trade Doesn't Work, is that David Ricardo himself did not believe, and you can show this from his writing, free traders hate it when you point this out, he did not believe that his theory proved that free trade was always and everywhere the best thing. He explicitly says, well, if you assume that capital doesn't move between nations, we're good. But if you allow for that possibility, okay, then the model starts to fall apart. And then he says, well, but yeah, there's a million reasons why capital doesn't move, having to do with institutions, property rights, so on and so forth. And this theory is just being abused. It's a good little mathematical gadget for figuring out your winnings when trade is a winning move for you. It does have some applications to some circumstances of very liquid markets.
There's an even more, sorry, Ian, there's even more fundamental critique of this, and that is that there is no free trade, and there has never been free trade, and we will never have it, no matter what any theory says. And you can see that because the only 2 or maybe 3 countries that kind of believe in it are the U.S., the U.K., and maybe Australia. I don't know. No, everybody else has sort of signed on to the WTO, all our free trade agreements, because they want access to our markets. But that's not how they think about running their economies. They all protect and support the industries that they consider important for reasons other, including defense, prestige, high wages, and that, the path dependency of the being in on the next big thing. So they put up trade barriers, and they don't play the game, and they never will. I mean, we're finally coming around. One of the things we say in this book is that we should be honest and say, look, okay, this is the game. Every country has the right, we should not object when other countries decide to support industries that they consider important. So it's kind of like don't get mad, just play the game. That's the game.
I think that maybe gets us to a question of this is the sort of reality or the realpolitik of the matter, and we have to engage in a like way. So, but this book does give its due to theory, economic theory, for developing industrial policy at a theoretical level. Dare I say abstract, which is not really the right word, but for lack of a better one. What is added by having a theory of industrial policy as opposed to just the toolkit, sort of a corpus of policies that have historically worked and can be applied in different circumstances? What do you guys think?
Well, the, the most fundamental thing is that almost none of these tools or sets of tools are effective alone. And if you don't coordinate the big three pillars of industrial policy are, first of all, you want to support the domestic development, commercialization, and production and export of the what we call advantageous industries that are tradable. The second is the trade policy that supports that, protect the infant industries or industries that we're trying to retain or even regain, because we have lost a lot of them, and protect the IP. That's all the whole tariff, quota, all these other kinds of things. That's pillar number two. And pillar number three is getting the currency exchange rate correct, which really means a rate. What do we mean by a correct? What's an appropriate? What's the right exchange rate? The only way to define it that makes any functional sense for any country is to say the exchange rates, and they're going to be different with different countries and different currencies, but the set of exchange rates that basically balances your trade, because that's what's supposed to happen with floating exchange rates. If you're a surplus country, you get too much of the other country's currency because they're buying in their currency, and it's supposed to be put back on the market. So you put more on the market, the price goes down, and so on. So they're supposed to come to the equilibrium is when trade balances. But that doesn't happen for two different kinds of reasons. One we're sort of familiar with, I'm sure you are, and that is that some countries manipulate their currency, or have done it, will do it again. China did it on a massive scale. Japan still does it. Korea does it. Taiwan does it. Switzerland does it. Germany doesn't have to do it explicitly because they have an artificially cheap EU because of the less productive countries that they're in. So for that, you need tariff, you need countervailing currency intervention, which means the U.S. Treasury goes into the market and buys the other country's currency, manipulating currency, making their currency cheaper and thus scarcer, and thus more pushing it up. But the other thing, which really isn't in the Overton window yet, is that there is a long-term, very large-scale net secular flow of capital into the United States, not from banks, not from government institutions, but private investors. Why? Well, it's the biggest capital market. It's the most liquid. It's the safest, rule of law. And by and large, it's been, the most long-term profitable. So what does that do? Well, that means there's more demand for dollars, because if you want to invest in U.S. stocks, bonds, treasuries, you need to pay in dollars. That pushes up the demand for dollars and therefore pushes up the currency. And that's a huge disadvantage. For example, China, on average, where U.S. currency is about 16% overvalued, 16% more expensive than it would take for the trade to balance. So if we don't pay attention to that, we just put in like a 16% tariff, the currency, overvaluation just wipes it out. So the theory, to come back to your original question, the theory, why you need the theory is because you need, it holds all these things together. It's very tempting. And I think a lot of that's happening now that, okay, we're doing industrial policy. That is a big change. And we are doing a piece of it. But we don't have a really coherent industrial policy. And that takes the theory that holds these things together.
That's a great explanation. That makes a lot of sense. And, building on that, and maybe Ian, you could speak to this too, is, when we're talking about industrial policy, we're talking about industry and building, industrial and like manufacturing tradables goods. You guys have also called it advantageous industries. Maybe you could say a bit more about what that means. But, in America, I guess we like to think of ourselves as a capitalist economy. We are in many ways with some limitations, but, we think that the market, if we have an issue or we need to grow an economy, we should let the market do it. And I'm curious what you guys think is, to give the markets their due, what are the things that they sort of do well on their own that would cohere with this theory of industrial policy, sort of super added onto or meshing with your theory of industrial policy?
Well, one of the important things to extend Marc's remarks, as well as to answer your own, is you need a theory because you have to be able to win the argument with market fundamentalists who want to tell you that the market answer is always right. I mean, the consensus in this country has been that, okay, you have a market, and then we allow exceptions to the market for political and humanitarian reasons. We have a welfare state, we have a defense budget, and then we accept the efficacy of Keynesian countercyclical spending, which every government engages in, whether they admit they understand what they're doing or not. But the productive core of the economy, where wealth is actually created, is and has to be, if it's going to work effectively, has to be a free market. Now, here's where I want to ask your audience to remember a little bit more deeply what it means to be conservative, which is not only to believe in free markets, which certainly have their place, but one of the things, if you read Burke, Aristotle, even Americans like Russell Kirk, you have to beware of seductive abstractions, which is something usually associated with the left. But market fundamentalism, the idea that markets are 100% of the answer for how you really create wealth in an economy, is a very dangerous half-truth. Now, the antidote to these seductive abstractions is something that conservatives also value: history. If you go and look at the actual economic history of, forget other countries, let's just talk about our own United States. If you go back and look at what were the actual economic ideals of the founding fathers, how did the U.S. develop the world's greatest economy in the second half of the 19th century, you discover things like the intellectual father of American capitalism was a gentleman from New York City called Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, a top aide to General Washington. And his views were not market fundamentalist. He's definitely a capitalist. He grew up, he was running a mercantile company in his teens in the West Indies. He's among other things, unlike a lot of economists, he was actually a successful business person. But he believed in tariffs. He did not believe that the U.S. should practice free trade with the rest of the world, above all with Great Britain, which at the time was the world's dominant manufacturing power. And he understood that if you just throw the American market open to British imports, you are going to have an extremely hard time, if you have any success at all, developing manufacturing industry in the United States. And it's easy to forget how dependent on Europe this country was for a long time. We were importing steel railroad rails up until about 1870. And that's why Hamilton...
Zoom in to like from 5,000 feet to 50 feet. Where do, being a kind of what we call extreme free market fundamentalist, means you think that You don't need the only thing you need from the government uh, is some basic research. Yeah, that's okay, but nothing else. But the fact of the matter is that basic research doesn't turn itself into a viable product. And for any big breakthrough, there's a long period of between, okay, we know how the nuclear physics works to a bomb or to a nuclear power or whatever it is. And that role is not, and has not been filled by uh, free capital markets. That's where government takes the risk. The projects are big. Every technology in the iPhone, for example, was pioneered and developed usually for some government purpose before it was at the stage where the risks of you could see what commercial product you could make. I mean, that's not visible for quite a while, and the risks of doing it were reduced in terms of the time scale and the level of risk and the level versus the level of the amount of capital has to be put in. So it gets into the venture capital window or the equivalent in a large corporation if they're doing it. So that's very fundamental. So that if you look back in history, not just in the U.S., and of course every company that comes up with these products likes to take credit for, going back to point of origin. But in fact, a government has been, or government funded, or you can treat the big public utilities like the old AT&T as kind of equivalent. They have the revenue and the long guaranteed revenue scale to make these big expensive bets. But that requires government. And you can say, well, the government makes mistakes. Sure, anybody working on a new technology will make mistakes. So you really have to think about government for the purpose of wanting to be in on the next big thing as having a portfolio, taking a portfolio approach, like a venture capital firm. Most things, a couple of things will fail. Some big things will just produce, well, but kind of okay. But a couple of big hits are really worth it. It can raise the whole level of the economy of a country, create a whole new set of jobs, or a technology like IT, which has really transformed almost every other and boosted every other manufacturing technology that we have.
Yeah, and when we're talking about industrial policy, really what we're talking about is manufacturing. So I guess I have a two-part question. One from the sort of the theoretical perspective: why is manufacturing distinctively important for an economy? On the one hand, aren't service sector jobs or knowledge production supposed to be sort of moving up the value chain, or supposed to be quote unquote better in some respect than manufacturing? So that would be like the first question from a theoretical perspective. And then on a more practical perspective, like which manufacturing in particular do we want or do we need? That's I think maybe the hinting to the subtitle of the book, which is winning the competition for good jobs in high value industries. Which are those today?
Okay. The first thing I'm going to say about manufacturing is you're absolutely correct that most of the economy is in other sectors and that living standards are a function of productivity in all sectors. We do know that. The reason that this book focuses on manufacturing is twofold. Number one, it's a domain in which the U.S. has to respond to foreign rivalry. There are all sorts of problems with U.S. home building right now that someone else can go on your show and talk about. We don't have to deal with the threat of somebody in Belgium or South Korea doing better than we do and therefore ending up taking all those jobs and those profits and so forth. So that's the first reason why we focus on manufacturing. The second reason we focus on manufacturing is that it's a sick sector in the U.S. right now. If you look at which sectors are thriving and which are not, it's no secret medicine, for example, is a sick sector. That's not our subject, but manufacturing is one of the sectors that's a real problem. If you go on the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis statistics website, which is the big website, the branch of the Fed that maintains the best set of government statistics, You can see that American manufacturing productivity has been basically stagnant for more than 10 years now. It's even, depending on how you measure it, declined a little bit. And that's quite shocking in the past 200 years, where the assumption is the economy, ever since the start of the Industrial Revolution, and we break free from the static pre-industrial world, productivity is supposed to be going up everywhere. It's not in manufacturing. Go look it up if you don't believe me. You may not believe me. Please go look it up. And the third reason that we're focused on manufacturing is the national security implications. You can't defend your country with websites and leverage buyouts, no matter how much money you can make building websites and conducting leverage buyouts. You can only defend your country with pieces of physical machinery, which are almost always made out of steel or aluminum and have a lot of electronics in them. And the US is dangerously behind. I mean, the Pentagon, I believe, recently calculated that China has 300 times our shipbuilding capacity. I mean, the numbers are so bizarre that you almost don't think they're real. But yeah, we do. I mean, we've seen with the Ukraine war that we are still living in a world of wars of attrition and heavy firepower. And, we're running down our supplies faster than we can build them. It's a big wake-up call, but the country has not.
Other things too. One is that manufacturing, one reason that productivity has been so stagnant is because we have lost a lot of the most efficient, the most advanced technology. We develop them, and then China and Japan and other countries make them. That's where all the money is. So that's another reason, and manufacturing is important also because it's a much bigger sector of the economy than people generally recognize. Yes, it's about 12% of GDP. That's the net output. But if you look at how many non-manufacturing jobs are created, it's much more. It's closer to 30%. And it also is the sector that most productively absorbs capital. You can put more capital into it. It's another way of saying that research, it pays for a lot of research. So it's the sector which historically, in which productivity has advanced the fastest. And that's how it's pulled up. In fact, it's pulled up wages from other sectors. So losing it is a very big deal for a lot of reasons.
And, looking back at American history, if manufacturing is today a sick sector, what would you say is the high point of American industrial policy and manufacturing or productive capacity? And what is the sort of the mix of policies that enabled that? And then maybe you could also speak to where you both think, and maybe this is at different points for each of you, we started to go off the rails in that respect.
Well,
Ian,
you can trace the history of how the US went off the rails fairly precisely, and we do just that in the book. The US embraced free trade after World War II, not because we'd suddenly discovered that it was bad policy. We embraced it because we had to prop up the economies of foreign countries due to the Cold War and bind them to dependence upon us. And at that moment in history, the US had technological advantage and scale advantage in every industry from soft drinks to submarines. So we could do this with very little cost to ourselves. And that held true up through the early 1960s. The 1961 Trade Expansion Act of the Kennedy administration was supported by the AFL-CIO. That was the last trade agreement they endorsed until USMCA under Trump. After that point, starting in the late 1960s, you started to see signs of economic damage to the United States from foreign competition. Now, because we had the Bretton Woods exchange rate system, the ability to run huge
Can you,
deficits. Yes?
can you explain what that is?
Fixed exchange rates. And for reasons I won't bore you with, they make it very difficult to run the kind of gigantic trade deficits that we have. Trade deficits today are 2 orders of magnitude as big as they were before 1971. In fact, for most of the pre-71 period, we ran small trade surpluses. Almost all countries had relatively balanced trade. That means that whatever goes wrong, it can't go very wrong in trade. As a result, we coasted for another few years, and it seemed that trade liberalization was okay. And as things really started to fall apart with the industrialization of China, and particularly with the US extending most favored nation, or permanent normal trade relations, as they renamed it, to China, as things started falling apart, the US by that point had largely forgotten the kind of economic analysis that would tell us that something was wrong. People were stuck in this Ricardian rationalization of whatever happens must be good for you, even if it doesn't look that way.
The other illusion, which started with Seward, Roosevelt's Secretary of State, was that remember just coming at the end of the Second World War, and with the mistaken remembrance that the Depression was partly caused by trade, which is not true, but that trade relations, deeper they were, the more they conduced to peace in the world and against war. That's proven to be a false belief, but that was part of it also. So, Ian, just to pick up on what Ian said, we coasted for a while, and actually we did more than coast because the trade war, the Cold War, really boosted the whole national security effort. And it was a science-based effort because the idea was we would never be able to produce as many foot soldiers as the Russians and other Chinese communists if they ever got into it, which they did in the Korean War, of course. So we had to do it by having more technically advanced weaponry, starting with nuclear bombs and delivery systems and so on. So big science-based defense establishment for many, many years. And that produced, we didn't call it industrial policy, that was national security. But in fact, the government did spend on developing a lot of fundamental technologies. IT certainly started. Computing started, and advanced chips were first used in intercontinental ballistic missiles, for example. So we've had that, and we also do the same thing with health. We have NIH, which is a huge successful industrial policy, but we haven't called it that. That's a different, those are mission, that's health. And now we have the space program, which was nurtured in a classically high industrial policy way. We kept everybody out of it. Every other country, didn't get their hands in it. We made all the technology ourselves, pretty much. And after this long gestation period, when we basically handed it off to the private sector with some big boost, some assistance in making the transition. And now it's a leading space. We have a leading private space industry in the world. So, but we never took the same approach to the broad question: how do you keep the broad economy and the good jobs going in every sector, every important sector? And as Ian mentioned earlier, it's not just the high tech, bleeding edge stuff. It's anything that it's sizable in scale, produces good jobs, absorbs a certain amount of capital in terms of refinement. So in washing machines, pretty pedestrian, but they're a whole lot better than they were when we were kids. And people who work in it are well paid. So that's been neglected because we weren't doing industrial policy. We're just doing defense and these different missions. Those were the exceptions.
Yeah, I'd love to hear you say more about that actually, because every free trader I know or I've ever heard of gives the national security exception. Well, we can interfere in the market, sort of I think what Ian was saying a little bit ago about, well, we can interfere in the market for national security reasons. But that is a much more limited set of exceptions or cases where the government or the public sector would interfere or be involved in the making of our economy or the shaping of our economy. So what are some of the distinctions there between, a more limited national security exception that fits within the parameters of basic free trade doctrine versus the more authoritative, though not authoritarian?
It's the same argument. It's just that the reasons that people say that it's okay to have the government do more of the steps from basic research to supporting production for national security. There are two. First of all, there's basically one buyer, the military. But other than that, what they're saying is, look, the private sector won't develop the technology to the point where the private sector will make it on its own. And that applies. They just think the result is more significant. There's greater risk in failing in national security. But the reason that they think it's necessary are the same reasons it's necessary for commercial satellites and any new breakthrough technology. They're just willing to make the exception that the basic what's driving innovation isn't any different.
It's a great point. Ian, you had something too?
Yeah, I would also question the idea that national security is a narrow exception to a free market policy. The idea that you can have free markets in everything, and then you have this little sector that makes special things like fighter jets. I don't think that works because the defense economy is totally dependent on the productivity and the productive assets of the non-defense economy. What you're talking about, if you're trying to have just a narrow exception for defense, is kind of like what the Soviet Union tried to do, where they had a socialized defense sector, as basically did we. If you've ever dealt with the Pentagon, it's not really a market. The difference was that their socialized defense sector, with a government buyer and everything under heavy government control, was resting on top of a very low productivity, dysfunctional communist economy, whereas ours was resting on top of the most productive economy in the world. How can the U.S. have a successful, for example, steel industry if we don't have a steel industry at scale? You have to have gigantic scale for efficient production of steel. So you have to have a strong civilian steel industry. How can you have a successful military aircraft industry if you don't have the backbone of a civil industry behind it? One of the things I recall reading during the Cold War, it was after the Cold War, one of the high-ranking Soviet generals was saying that one problem they had in the Soviet Union was that American teenagers get drafted into the army and they're used to pocket calculators, video games, they're used to electronics. The average Russian teenager gets drafted into the Red Army, they've never seen electronics before. And that,
sorry, Ian.
Well, that made me think that the two are very much dependent on one another. And one of the things we learned with COVID, where we suddenly have this incredible need for masks, and we discover that manufacturing masks requires these special weaving machines that there's only one or two places in the world you can buy them from, and there's a 2 years waiting list, is the humblest items can turn out to be critical for national security. So I don't think you can draw that exception and say, okay, we're going to have a narrow exception for national security and then just let the whole rest of the economy be free markets.
As a striking example, for a long time, the military sector, industrial military sector, had spin-offs to the private sector. The first chips and on and on and on, materials and so on. And for computing, it's turned out to be the other, it's now reversed. It's spin on because the military demand isn't big enough. It's too specialized to fund and develop the major advances in computing. So now the civilian computing sector dwarfs the military. They move faster and so on and so on. So without having the civilian sector, we wouldn't be able to make the weapons that we now do make.
Those are all great points, and we're starting to come towards the end of our time. So I want to be able to save some time to ask a couple questions about some more contemporary policy applications. And I think that maybe the place to start, at least for me, is looking at what our rival or what our biggest rival is doing. One of the strengths of the book is you do some country case studies, one of which was focusing on China. And China as a civilization is much different from the United States in many ways, from their politics, their economic model, their society. So that's, I'm not suggesting or saying, we need a Chinese style economy in the United States, but I'm curious what you guys think China has been doing that's been successful that we could learn from and maybe implement in our own way here.
Above all, the lesson you learn from China is this myth that everything has to be free markets to succeed is just not empirically true. Now, people who were paying attention could have figured this out from the success of Japan in the 1980s. And yes, it does take a bit of effort to grasp that China is not a free market wonderland that some libertarian types still bizarrely seem to think that it is. But when you realize that free markets are not the only way, that forces you to rethink your basic assumptions about economics. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean, as you said, that we should do things the way they do them. For a start, they're in very different circumstances than we are. And for a second, one of the implications of the kind of economics that we believe in, myself, Mark, the rest of our organization, the Coalition for a Prosperous America, is that there's more than one way to skin a cat. And this is deeply baked into the idea of what in technical terms are called multiple equilibria. But still, you've got to go back to the basics and say, okay, now that we've finally admitted that markets are one part of a successful economy and that there are exceptions illustrated not only by China, but by America's own history, because we were a tariff-protected economy up until World War II, maybe we should revisit the idea that tariffs are a valid policy. Maybe we should look more deeply into the idea that the entire technological food chain is not something that works well in the private sector. The private sector is great at commercializing things that are close to finish, that are ready to be commercialized. But the private sector did not invent the internet. It did not invent jet passenger planes. It did not invent a whole bunch of other stuff we talk about in chapter 19. That's what people have got to start afresh from first principles and rethink your views of the whole of economics on this basis. That's what you learn from China.
You can also see, we talked about earlier, they take a very broad and coherent view of industrial policy. They don't think about They think about their currency exchange rates. They manipulate them, and they're also very good at, as they advance their own technology advances, their trade policy tracks along with it. They adjust. It's not like, and that's a very important thing about industrial policy. It's never once and done. It has to evolve not only with our own economy, where our technology is, but what's happening in the world. What are our trade counterparties? I don't like to call them partners because we're not always partners, but our trade, what are their economies doing? And what tactics are they using? Almost every country, advanced country now, does not rely mostly on tariffs directly. They have non-tariff trade barriers. Sure, you can send in all the cars you want, Japan once said, but they have to go through this port. And by the way, we don't like this the way your lug nuts are fastened on, and so you have to check everyone, inspect everyone. There are millions of ways. There's a list of, I don't know, a couple thousand non-tariff trade barriers. We don't. Why do we sell many cars in Korea? Well, maybe they're not as good now because the Korean cars are pretty good, but they just don't let them in. They find ways to keep them out. So fundamentally, you have to expect that, and we need to play the same game. Now, I will say, 'cause you haven't asked this question, but I think we ought to say it. It doesn't mean that every trade is a win lose. There are examples where trade makes sense, probably not in the most strategic industries, or where you have a really friendly country like and the investments are too big for one country to do alone. If you can really wrap it up in a package, that makes sense. But the idea of broad free trade, everything goes, they haven't worked for the United States. Every time we've signed on to one, and you can go back to, you can consider China, WTO, and or normal trade relations as a treaty, NAFTA, and our Korea trade agreement. The projections were always our deficit will go down and our exports will go up. Exactly the opposite has happened. Every country, Mexico, we don't know, and every other one of them.
So if we're talking about countering phenomena like that, not only would it be better trade policy that has an eye towards balance of trade, but it's also reshoring is an imperative. And then innovate. If I'm something I'm taking away from this conversation, I think is you need to be somewhat at the cutting edge with an economy of scale, and industries that are sort of at the frontier of the future of high value manufacturing. And so I'm curious how you do that in terms of innovation and also education, because something maybe you're familiar with David Goldman from the Asia Times. Often likes to talk about. He's interested in various industrial policy things and looking at American economic and industrial history. But one of the things he points out today is like there's 1 million manufacturing jobs that are currently sitting open, just currently. So if we're talking about manufacturing into the future, how are we going to educate the sort of people, the people to do the sorts of jobs that we need to have this sort of high wage growth, high productivity gains, high output, and advanced industry?
Well, we do say we couldn't. The book is 700 plus pages of text.
You can't talk about everything, right?
Yeah, we couldn't talk about everything. We say in the book, and we do recognize that that's important. There is a lot of good research and thought about it, and we do definitely have to educate people properly and keep educating them. The Germans have a terrific system for doing that, of lifetime education and different tracks from the highly academic to mixed academic and training skills. And some of our companies do a great job of it. Nucor Steel does a terrific job of bringing in people, training them both academically and on the job, and to a very high level, and often people without a lot of conventional, certainly without 4-year college degrees, which has been greatly overemphasized as an exclusive, high prestige track. But we don't address that in detail, but it certainly is critical.
And then in terms of innovation, or Ian, go ahead.
Another issue that we flag as important and don't really talk about very much is the financialization of the U.S. economy, which has been a disaster for American management and has acted as a kind of anti-industrial policy. What I mean by that is the way that the financial sector tail has come to wag the dog of the real economy. That is a problem, the solution for which is beyond our scope, but we do talk about its many impacts on American industry, which have been really bad.
Warren Cass is really good on that too, by the way.
Yes, he is, absolutely. Yeah, and then I guess asking a question about innovation, one of the things I've kind of gathered is the government has to help innovate or support basic R&D. Could you put some more teeth on, if not a specific plan or a proposal, dare I say the concepts of a plan for reviving America's innovation sector?
Sure. The basic concept you need is that there's a pipeline of innovation from pure science discovery to sale of a product to a customer. And many of those steps can be done in a for-profit private sector organization. However, many of them cannot because the research is too long-term, it's too risky, it's research that if you discover something, you can't keep it to yourself and then make all the money. So this research is either going to get done by government labs or nonprofits like universities, or in the old days, it was done by companies like AT&T, which were government-sanctioned monopolies that knew that they could do research that was only going to pay off in 30 years and that they'd have a monopoly, so they would capture any of the benefits. Bell Labs died with the breakup of AT&T in 1984. So the pipeline has become leaky. There's all kinds of research that is not taking place in this country, though nations like China understand this and they push it through using the authority of the state. You need institutions like there is something called Manufacturing USA, which is a network of manufacturing-oriented technology development and diffusion institutions where they are tasked with not only researching technologies, not science, pure science, technologies, and actually transmitting them to companies, which helps keep it oriented to the real needs of corporate America.
These are partnerships between private sector companies and the government. So it's some government funding, having funding from the participating companies in each of these institutes is critical too. So they have skin in the game, and it's a great program. We have 16 of those now. It started during the Obama administration. We're supposed to have 45. So, but it's hugely underfunded, and scale makes a big difference. China has 45. I don't know how good they are, how much, how well established, but this program has been reviewed by a couple of big accounting firms, ours, highly successful, but hugely underfunded. The same is true for the manufacturing. The equivalent for small manufacturers is the manufacturing extension program. It's like the farm extension program for manufacturers. The idea is the target objective is to provide the resources so that every small manufacturer as part of the supply chains that's interested and able to do it with some help can apply the best available technology to their manufacturing and the best available business practices. That's a kind of help. It's kind of giving somebody a seed to grow from rather than just money. That's a good program. It's been beefed up to focus on those things, not just focus on making your assembly line more efficient, which has been the traditional focus. But again, hugely underfunded. On the brand new companies side, there are a number of different ideas in the book. Some of them came from Senator Rubio's reauthorization bill for the Small Business Act, Small Business Administration. For example, loans for application of new technology to small businesses that are non-dilutive. And longer term loans than the private sector is usually willing to provide, private banks willing to provide for buying capital equipment for small businesses. There is now legislation which requires these Manufacturing USA institutes, which are mostly big companies, to coordinate with small manufacturers that are in their supply chains. All these things make sense. And then for venture capital firms, we have heard the phrase "the valley of death." You know, there are ways you want to help get help them get across the valley of death. There are institutions that big like MIT and other major research universities have set up these incubators, these different partnerships to help the entrepreneur who's coming out of a lab connect with the private sector companies who might want to help them introduce the product or develop a working model. So there are lots of good ideas, and a whole bunch of them in the book. But in the Chips and Science Act, there's a broad directive applied to every program is to focus not just on inventing it, but getting it commercialized in the United States. But the only appropriated money on scale is for the actual chips. So again, we need to actually spend the money. It's not good enough just to have the idea.
It's worth
Well,
looking at,
go ahead, Ian.
my apologies. It's worth looking at the fact that the US government actually has a pretty good track record of developing technologies. People sometimes talk about this as if it's a guaranteed cesspool of corruption and irrationality. But if you look at the technologies that have been developed, there are misses, just like in the private sector, but the overall record, I respectfully submit, is pretty good.
Well, this has been a great conversation. I think very educational for me, hopefully for our listeners as well. And we've talked about a lot of different ideas and policy prescriptions that we could use or have used in the past that might be worth bringing back that other countries are doing. My last question to you both is, in the Trump and Biden administrations, both have used, in the first Trump and the Biden administration, both used tariffs and brought that back into the public conversation in a pretty significant way. And then during the Biden administration, they passed the CHIPS Act, bipartisan passage. And now in the second Trump administration, he's already talking about tariffs again. So my question to you both would be, what is the recommendation that you would have for United States policymakers that we aren't already talking about tariffs, the CHIPS Act, that, the sort of not talked about golden gem that would go a big way to having an effective industrial policy for the U.S.?
Well, the biggest one is the sleeping, the unseen elephant in the room is to focus on managing the exchange rate. That having a competitive exchange rate and therefore not having a big trade deficit is the biggest single thing we can do to boost our economy, to help our new ventures succeed, to help our existing companies export, and so on. So that if I had to say, okay, let's take one issue that isn't in the public discourse now and really dig into it, that would be it.
Thanks, Mark. What about you, Ian?
I would say the same thing. People don't realize what a big deal international capital flows are, how destructive uncontrolled international capital flows have been, pushing up the value of the dollar. Nobody is talking about it. But if Trump wants to impose a 15% tariff when the dollar is overvalued by 16%, wasting. Well, he's going to make things a little bit better than they would be, but you can see why he'd be wasting his time.
Mm. All right. Well, on that note, that's a good place to end. And again, a lot of food for thought, and even more in the book, Industrial Policy for the United States. By the time this episode comes out, I think it'll be available in the United States, but from Cambridge University Press. Congratulations to you both. If people want to focus and find either more work on this project or on your other projects, where should they look?
Amazon.
Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, the other answer to your question is this book, there's nothing like this book available, or to the extent that we know, in the works. There are plenty of books on free trade, thousands of them, arguing against the people who argue against free trade and so on. But there's the reason we made this as comprehensive as we could is because there was nothing else that we could sort of say, well, we'll cover this and you read that one for that. This is the only thing that, as far as we know, that pulls it all together.
Excellent. It is quite comprehensive. Thank you both for joining me again.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us on your show.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.